The only thing we are promised in this life is the very cessation of it, death, the coldest mistress, the most patient companion. Some fear it, some worship it. Today, we experiment with death.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to This is an Experiment. Today is episode 7. I'm super excited about that. And the topic of discussion for today is death, one of the more taboo topics that we've discussed on this podcast, but should be exciting, should be interesting. And I know Adenise is really excited about this episode. So what do you think? Are you ready?
I'm very excited. This is one of those philosophical episodes. We're going to get a little philosophical. Last week we talked about climate, which was an incredible episode. Again, I hope everybody took something major away, because that is something that could actually be applied and is within the scope of reality, within
Absolutely.
our reality.
Mm-hmm.
But today we're going to stay within reality, but we're also going to kind of explore into the dark unknown of what death is. So so should we hop right into it?
Yes.
All right. So death.
What is the meaning of life?
What is the meaning of life? So, I mean, for death, I guess the best way to kind of start all of this, right, is to give death a definition or understand what the definition of death actually is. So, with that being said, the definition of death is the permanent cessation of all biological functions that sustain a living organism.
Wow.
What's your takeaway on that definition?
That is interesting, because I really like the emphasis on biological. So we're talking about just the biological functions that keep our body operating. I know, like in like the medical field, I think when the heart stops beating, they're like medically dead, medically deceased.
Right. Yeah.
But then, because people can like die but then come back to life because their heart, they can like resuscitate them and then they're alive again. So I really like that it's specifically talking about the biological functions ending, which, I mean, yeah, that is the scientific definition of death. So interesting. Yeah, I think it's cool. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with it. And again, the emphasis on biological functions is an interesting emphasis. Because obviously, if we look at life on a scientific, within a scientific paradigm, biology is life. I mean, bio literally means life, and ology is the study of, right? So the study of life.
Latin roots 101.
Latin roots. Is that Latin roots or is it Greek? Because I know they kind of mix and match. I think it's Latin.
Who knows?
Maybe. Shoot.
Another episode.
Another episode. Actually, Latin versus Greek.
We already did language, so we're kind of.
Too late, dude. We can't backtrack.
Nope.
All right. So I pretty much how I perceive death is pretty much this definition. It's the cessation, and notice it says permanent cessation.
Yes.
So there are individuals who experience what is called NDEs, which is abbreviated for near death experiences, which we will actually dive into. So they were technically dead, but then there's a little contradictory happening there. So that's why I think it's important to emphasize on permanent,
right?
The permanent cessation, the permanent stopping of all things that keep an organism living. So I guess go ahead.
I just want to point out that word permanent, because like I think that is really what makes death so like difficult to understand, is like we don't even really understand like permanent or like forever, like permanent, forever, those kinds of words where there is no end and or beginning. That's where it kind of gets, I think that use of that word was very deliberate, and that we don't understand like permanent, what that actually means. Because I mean, you could look at like a tattoo on your body and say that's permanent, right? But technically, like you could get that removed, or when your body is no longer there, it's that tattoo no longer exists, or whatever it may be. So permanent is like, I don't think really understandable. So it makes like, that's what makes kind of death difficult to understand.
Yeah, that's actually a really, really good point. Another thing I'd like to note is I lost my train of thought. Oh, on the topic of tattoos, like even when you're living, it's technically still not permanent because the sun's rays are deteriorating the tattoo. That's why they always say like when you get a fresh tattoo, like keep it away from the sun, or try to keep it away from the sun as much as possible. And even life itself is not permanent. It is permanent in the sense that we are within our awareness, right?
Right.
Because as soon as awareness is dissipated, obviously the awareness of life, or what life is gone.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's kind of an interesting thing to point out, because again, permanent, what is permanence?
Yeah.
It's the process in which something is occurring to an indefinite end,
Right.
meaning we don't know when the end is, or if there even is an end.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is really something interesting. Yeah. So I agree. The emphasis on permanent is pretty important for the definition of death. So what do you think? So okay, to be a little bit to get a little more within reality. Have you heard any interesting stories of like what the process of death is, in terms of like what people have experienced, or have you heard anything in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard the typical like light at the end of the tunnel type thing. I've heard of people like experiencing like loved ones, people experiencing some sort of deity like figure. Yeah, like, so that, I guess, is like what I mean, this would be a whole nother discussion, I guess, like what your soul is experiencing, like once you're like clinically dead. Yeah, I've heard of like those types of experiences.
Okay, so I'm actually going to dive into that. But before I do, the biological, just to give the listeners, to kind of lay a foundation here of what the process of death is, for those that like what is it like when you're dying. So what happens is, obviously your breathing will become more gentle and slow, and there are parts in your brain that begin to shut down. These are the physiological outputs, I guess you could call it, of what is occurring within your brain. That is what we see. And there's something called a death rattle, and the death rattle is essentially, it's where the breathing becomes so raspy. It's because your brain is no longer aware that saliva or mucus is beginning to build up in your airway. When any given day, you and I, when something is in our throat, we like subconsciously we clear our throats, right? Like without really thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
So the death rattle is it's the removal of that. Your brain becomes unaware, or if it is aware, it doesn't really care to clear the throat. So that's why when people are really, really close to death, you hear these things about death rattling and things like that. It's where the breathing seems really painful when it's actually not. Your body is so relaxed, and that is the slow that is pretty much when somebody is about to pass away, is when the death rattle becomes.
That's interesting. I mean, I won't get into like the details of the situation, but I've experienced that. Like I've seen that in real life, and I had no idea like what the like clinical description of that was, what that was. So it's like super, now I like know that's what that, and it's also comforting to hear that it wasn't painful. So that's cool.
Yeah. So death is, go ahead.
Oh yeah. I just wanted to say one more thing. I guess in these situations that we're talking about, or what you're describing, like the process of dying, this is like in a more natural sense, I would say, because I mean, there's obviously situations where people die and there's no time for these events to transpire, or you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, when people think death, like, oh, of course there are situations where death is painful, right?
Mhm.
But in a given in a given circumstance where it's like a hospital setting or whatever it may be, or if they're just at home or
Yeah,
they're in
you're dying of
hospice.
old age or something.
Yeah, if you're dying of natural causes, we'll say
Right.
the process of death itself is actually really peaceful. And we'll get into that when we start talking about near death experiences.
Mm.
But before we do, I would actually like to discuss something that you had mentioned, the whole light at the end of the tunnel and life flashing before your eyes. So there's
Oh yeah.
actually a theory about that. And there's a few theories that we'll cover, but the first theory is the involvement of a chemical called DMT. That is the abbreviation of it, but the actual scientific name is dimethyltryptamine. And dimethyltryptamine is essentially it's a psychedelic. It's a hallucinogen.
Right. People take that at like Coachella.
Yeah, they take that, and the whole not to dive too into it, but apparently not apparently, you inhale it, you smoke it,
Yeah.
and for the next 15 minutes you experience what some say is absolutely life-changing. Whether it actually is or not, it I would say it changes your perspective on life.
Right.
So what happens is it's kind of like a enhanced LSD trip, all within 15 minutes. You begin to see, geometric shapes, colors become far more defined, things begin moving that are typically inanimate. And some people actually claim that they see things called mechanical gnomes or beings on the other side.
Whoa.
Yeah. And some people they say this drug, or this psychedelic rather, DMT, is a gateway to the other side. Whether that other side is, if this is what death is, or the other side of just like the other side of what consciousness is, or the higher plane of consciousness, that's up for debate.
Yeah.
But there is a common denominator here where they say they see these beings, but I'm a little bit skeptical of that because, okay, say you've never done DMT, right? I've never done it either, but hypothetically, let's say this. I take it, right? And I come to you, I'm like, Nick, I just saw these, like, I took DMT and I saw these beings, I saw these aliens. You should take it and see if you see them.
Right.
Now in your mind, you have a conception of what, or an expectation of what you're going to experience.
Yeah.
So when you take this drug, now that expectation is mentally set in your mind that you're going to see beings. So your mind can actually create that reality while you're on the drug.
Right.
Right.
It like clings to that as like the centerpiece of that experience.
Exactly. So
Right.
it creates it. So what would be interesting is to collect people who have never heard of DMT or anything.
Yeah.
And test them and see if that is still the common denominator, whether or not they will see these beings.
And open the scene for Stranger Things.
Yeah. So that's a little bit about DMT. And a college in London, the Psychedelic Research Group at the Imperial College in London, actually tested this. They gave 13 participants DMT and a placebo. And apparently there were 16 items that people stated. And within those 16 items, 9 of them overlapped. So some of them were unearthly environment, peace, joy, bright light, altered perception of time and perception itself. So there was some overlap in things that people experienced. And this is also something that a lot of people say they experience during death. So that's what the overlap is. It's the overlap of items between people that are on DMT and people that what they say they've experienced during near-death experiences.
Right.
And so go ahead. Yeah.
Did you say that when you are dying that that chemical is released as well, or is
Right. Yeah. So
Oh,
I'm
okay.
actually going to get into that. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So the whole theory here is that your brain releases an X amount of dimethyltryptamine of DMT
Hmm.
to kind of help the passing to be
Whoa.
more peaceful. And so when people say they see, you know, light at the end of the tunnel, they see their life flashing before their eyes. That's a very popular a thing that somebody says when they experience near death experiences. They
Hmm.
say they see their life flashing before their eyes. So that is one of the items that is overlapping with DMT. So that could be DMT causing all of that. And there's actually a professor of psychiatry from the New Mexico Medical School. His name is Rick Strassman.
Hmm.
He actually made that claim. And he said near death experiences are caused by the release of DMT. So that is a theory. It's a popular theory, I guess, that's what the whole, you know, thing that you experience, the light flashing and the peace and everything like changing around you, that is what death is. It's the release of DMT.
That's crazy. I mean, it makes
Yeah.
sense, right? Like, I guess it's kind of evolution doing us a favor in that respect, or maybe not even evolution, but whatever uh, this existence is to have kind of a way of easing the end, if that makes sense.
No,
That's
yeah,
that's cool.
absolutely. Absolutely.
But
Yeah.
it sounds like we're kind of playing with God when we have this chemical that we can take and then mimic that experience, become
Yeah. Yeah. I agree.
making it a little bit less sacred. Um, Interesting.
Yeah. So apparently, I'm not, don't quote me on this, but I think DMT is actually one of the most abundant chemicals found within nature. I
Whoa.
think, or alternatives of it. I don't know. Like in chemistry, it's called like isotopes when there's like a
Oh, right,
different
right.
version of.
Yeah,
So I don't want to call it an isotope, but there's different versions of DMT
right. I mean,
apparently
yeah. So it makes
found
sense,
within nature.
but the different um, relatives, we'll call it for a simpler term,
Relatives,
they'll
yeah,
probably have much different effects because I know there's like just the most minute change within a molecule can like have significantly different effects on its interactions with other molecules. So, but I see what you're saying. Like
yeah,
that group with that DMT is within is like the most abundant. That would make sense.
yeah, yeah. So I think another term is analog, like chemical analog or structural analog. I think that's another term that's
Okay.
used in chemistry, but I don't know if I'm using it correctly. I'm not a chemist, so I don't know. But anyways, so interestingly enough, so what do you think about that? What do you think about the whole? I know you kind of said we're kind of playing God, but what's your approach on us? What's your approach on DMT? We'll start with that.
Well, I mean, as with everything, I feel like there's no like clear cut way to kind of look at the situation. Now, you could look at it as it's just like a biological reaction that occurs in the brain when you're dying as a result of you dying. And then that is that. And then you die, right? So you experience that release of DMT and then that's it. Um, and then, as with taking the drug, it's the same thing where you're taking it, you're experiencing it, and then your body flushes it out, not because you're dying, but just because, I don't know, it's natural to just get rid of it eventually, 15 minutes or whatever, and then you go about your day. Um, you could also look at it as this chemical is like the key for unlocking that part of consciousness and preparing you for whatever it is after death. In the same way that people that are advocates for taking DMT look at it as it opens your consciousness up to the wide array of what else there is around us within the universe in terms of being a conscious being. So there, I mean, that's how I kind of see it. There's no clear cut answer, as there is a lack of answers for a lot of things, I think, in this world. But it's interesting to just kind of compare the two different alternatives as to what DMT in the experience of death and the role that it plays, and then how it is used outside of that experience. It's interesting to ponder that for sure.
Yeah, and what I would also like to touch on is So does this? So let's say you take DMT.
Hmm.
So does this mean it opens the realm of death? Is DMT the gateway into the dimension of death or the plane of death? You know what I mean? Like, is
Yeah.
what you're seeing what dead people see or what dead people are experiencing? But then that would also assume that awareness or consciousness still exists after death,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
Because if you don't have awareness or consciousness, then what is there anything actually happening? And
Right.
that's an interesting thing to consider, right? Like, people say death is as if you were asleep. When you're asleep, you don't experience anything. You literally shut down
Yeah.
for 5, 6, 7, 8 hours at a time.
Hmm. Right.
So what's your take? What do you think? Because there's a saying, sleep is the cousin of death, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean
And so
that's awesome. I mean, that's a cool analogy. When you're, but the thing is, when you're sleeping, you can dream too. You know what I mean? And I feel like also when you're sleeping, you can definitely interact with the world around you um, to an extent. Like there still can be external inputs when you're sleeping that I think kind of differentiates that experience from death. But I like always think about have you ever had like a major surgery where you've had to be put under?
no, I haven't, and I'm actually terrified of having any type of surgery that puts me under the knife.
So I had my wisdom teeth removed, and for that they used anesthesia, and I was knocked out. That experience for me was not even close to sleep. It was literally like I was like turned off and turned back on. Because I mean, when you're sleeping, like I feel like you're kind of aware that you're sleeping. You know what I mean? Like sometimes when you're really tired, maybe you knock out and then you'll wake back up or something, and it's like, whoa, that was weird. But this was literally like nothing happened in between, like almost like I jumped in time. Like I was asleep. The guy was talking to me. They were giving me the anesthesia, and then the next thing I knew, it was like cut paste. Now I'm back in existing basically again, and I had like cotton in my mouth. Like it was the weirdest thing, and so that's kind of what I think about when I think about like if it is just the end. Like that's how I would like associate it. Not saying that is what it is, but um, that's kind of something I think about it when I'm considering comparing it to like sleep or maybe being put under.
Yeah. So it's funny because I've actually had that happen to me. I remember I was at the dentist once. I mean, unless they like unknowingly drugged me, but I fell asleep. I fell asleep, and before I knew it, I woke up, and they were like, "Oh, you knocked out there. Like, we're done." I'm like, "Wait, well, what do you mean we're done?" I literally like it feels like it's been like 1 second, and they're like, "No, we're done." And I, again, like cotton in my mouth. I couldn't feel my half of my face, and I was like, "What the hell just happened?"
Yeah.
So, yeah, so that is exactly what it is. Like when you're asleep, I guess you are kind of aware. I mean, you're aware in a sense that if something were to happen around you, you would become aware of it.
Yeah, you would wake
But
up. Whereas like
right,
this, when you're like under like whatever anesthesia, like you're done. Like you're you're not waking up. I mean, people are literally like cutting into your body and you're not waking up. So I think that's like kind of the next like level of unconsciousness versus sleep.
right, exactly.
Hmm.
So I don't know. It's interesting,
But
but
I
there's
mean,
an argument.
yeah,
Go
but I
ahead,
mean,
go
what's
ahead, go ahead.
cool about like the idea of associating death and sleeping is when you're sleeping, you're dreaming, right? And so,
Right.
I mean, I think I was even talking to my girlfriend about this. Like, she was having a dream, and she just talked about how like a bunch of sequence of events just did not make sense to her. And I was like, yeah, I mean, I have those dreams all the time. I'll be in my apartment and then be somewhere across the world within the same like space, but different, and like everything just doesn't make sense. Have you had those kind of dreams?
I don't know. I can't say that I have.
It's
I'm
like
not sure.
it's like time and space don't like they're not existent almost. and then like it can seem like a long time within a short dream. So what I'm saying is like that this maybe even just dreaming is kind of the pathway or kind of the gateway into what it could be like, where there is no like time or space reference. It's just like kind of your consciousness like floating through these weird like sequence of events. Because that's really like how I kind of see dreaming. In my experience, at least, there's been times where I'm like, I have no idea what's going on. It just doesn't. None of this makes sense. There's a bunch of weird events
But I'm
going
here
on.
for the ride.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm here for the ride. And then there's other times where it seems like, I mean, they say I think you always dream, but most of the time you forget like the dreams you've had. But it seems like sometimes I don't dream at all, which is interesting. But yeah, I don't know. It would be. I think it'd be kind of cool to if it was something, because what I'm trying to allude to is that if you die and you do enter this, like your consciousness enters this space of like floating through a bunch of different sequences, and time. The key here is that time and space are like kind of irrelevant. Then it might be kind of cool, because then like there is no like forever and there is no end. It's just kind of like like it sounds like kind of scary now, like the idea of just like floating in like these conscious scenarios forever. But I don't know, if time and space were irrelevant, maybe it wouldn't be the weirdest thing in the world.
Yeah. So, I mean, we could also get into like the concept of time, but we'll leave that for a separate episode.
Yes, sir.
But essentially, there are beliefs, there's like philosophical beliefs that time itself is actually an illusion, and if you look at the time space time on a block. There are, I don't want to get too deep into it, but the reason that time and space or time is an illusion, let's say you have a block, right? Or let's say you have a cube. A cube is easier to kind of conceptualize or visualize in the head. You have a cube and you have two dots that are in opposite sides of the cube. Okay. Like let's say you have one at the top right and then you have another at the bottom left.
Mm-hmm.
With just looking at it that way, there is no concept of time. It's just two dots in space time. Right. But if you slice the cube vertically, now there is a concept of what time is, because obviously you can read it as, okay, the first slice is first and the last slice is last. So now we have a definition or an operant definition of time, because so if the dot is on the first slice, that means this dot occurred first, right? Do you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Right. But somebody else could look at it from right to left and they'll say, no, well, this dot was first and that dot was last. Yeah. So this dot occurred before that dot. We'll call it lightning strikes. This lightning strike occurred before that lightning strike. Okay, well then what if somebody cut it horizontally or diagonally? Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So then comes the question of, okay, well, now the concept of time is relative to one's perception. So that's kind of a quick summary of why time might be an illusion. But again, we'll leave that for another episode.
And dropped an Easter egg on that.
An Easter egg there.
Yeah.
There you go. But to get back on track, there are kind of arguments against the whole near-death experience and DMT relativity or correlation. People say that near-death experiences are life-altering, right? Like when somebody experiences what it was like to die, it completely changes them, and it completely changes their outlook on life for the rest of their lives. Whereas dreams, as you mentioned, dreams and things that are like psychedelics, like DMT, they're not really life-changing. They might have some temporary change in your perception of what life is or the meaning of life, but they're not as impactful as near-death experiences. So that is an argument that is created, saying there is no, or the correlation is weak between near-death experiences and DMT.
Interesting. Have you heard of telomeres?
Yeah, like the things at the end of chromosomes, I think, or like what kind of holds chromosomes together or cells
Yeah.
together, I think.
Yeah, like the
Right. Yeah.
theory that those are like kind of the clock on our lives, and that when we run out of telomeres, our cells can't replicate anymore, and then that's what causes aging and eventually death. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I've heard of that. Yeah.
yeah, and then also telomeres could also be responsible for cancer because if you overproduce them, then those cells keep replicating indefinitely, and then you grow a tumor, and then you have cancer. Uh, I think that concept is like super interesting, or those like the knowledge of those being so influential because like the idea that we could control telomeres through like there's an enzyme that we know that we've discovered that produces those telomeres, and like if you could control that production, you could on one hand probably cure cancer, and on the other hand maybe even like dabble in immortality, which is just like mind-boggling to me. What do you think about that?
Yeah. 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 That's actually interesting. So what's interesting about cancer? Um, it's an organ. It's essentially an organism living within another organism. Because if you look at a cancer's genetic code, its genome,
Hmm.
it's completely different than, God forbid, let's say you have cancer.
Yeah.
The genome of your cancer is different than your genome as a person.
Right. Right.
It's pretty much completely changed.
Right. Because it's mutated.
And
Right? It's mutated
yeah,
from.
it's
from
mutated exactly.
yeah.
And to touch on the whole thing about like telomeres and cancer, I'm not a biologist, so this is kind of just what I know.
Hmm.
From what I understand, um, what goes on with the telomeres in cancer cells, I think they kind of become immortalized in a way because how one way cancer occurs is there is a gene in your chromosomes. It's
Hmm.
at one of the tail ends of your chromosomes. It's called the TP53 gene.
Hmm.
And that TP53 gene produces a protein called P53. And P53 executes a process called apoptosis. And apoptosis is the programmed death of a cell. So
Hmm.
when a cell is sick, that protein executes this event called apoptosis, and the cell shoots out a message signaling all neighboring cells saying, hey, I'm sick, I'm killing myself.
Whoa.
As morbid as that sounds. Yeah. And so what happens somewhere along the way, that gene gets turned off, or that protein doesn't execute apoptosis,
Hmm.
and these cells, they become immortalized.
Yeah.
So it's literally an immortal being, cancer essentially living inside of you. So I do think, like you touched on a very good point, if we can harness that mutation
Hmm.
within cancer, I think we beat death.
Which is
As weird as
not.
that
Yeah,
sounds.
man. Well, I mean, I don't remember where I heard this, but I know like as like a species, or even I think all like living things on Earth, like death is kind of like the idea that we can't live forever. Like let's say like no accidents happened, or like there was no other like outstanding scenario where we would die. Like
Right.
you
So natural
obviously,
cause.
yeah, you would die of old age. You would just eventually like this process that we're talking about where your cells like just start to die off would occur, and you would just die naturally. But the reason I guess that we do that, or living things on this planet do that, is that there's like so many different scenarios in like there's so much probability that you could die regardless of that process, that it doesn't make sense. Like it doesn't add up to sustain each individual for forever, because it's going to die anyways, if that makes sense.
Kind of. I'm a little bit lost. Can you maybe elaborate a little more?
Yeah, so basically the idea is that there's no like, because of just the variability in existence, there's no reason to for a single being to live forever, because no matter what, eventually it would die. That's
Okay. So you're saying like no matter what,
yeah.
that being will experience death because of the
The ver-
whole biological reason.
no, just because of the variability. I'm saying like let's say that there is a being that could live forever
Oh,
biologically.
okay. So biologically, he can live forever, but because there's so many different ways one can die, it's
Exactly.
going to happen
Yes.
regardless.
Could fall off a cliff, could get hit by a bus, could,
Okay.
millions of like, so all those different, so it doesn't make like evolutionary sense for a being to live forever.
I mean, yeah, you're right because so what happens if some being lives forever? That means their genetic code stays the same, or even if it were to mutate, it would mutate within themselves, and it wouldn't be passed down to any other organism.
Right.
So you know what I mean? Like let's say to the whole idea of evolution is to mate, pass your genes down, and create genetic variability within your offspring, and then
Mhm.
you die.
Yeah.
And then your offspring is technically a better version or a genetically more adapt version of you to the environment that you are in, right?
In most circumstances, unless there's inbreeding.
In most circumstances, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's like the general idea, right?
Right.
So yeah, no, you're right. Yeah,
No, I mean, I think that's a much better system than hoping that, a group of individuals can just not, do something stupid and die by some other way. Um, I think that idea of passing on the genes, I mean, it is kind of in a way like immortalizing. You know what I mean? Like we all have genes from the first humans millions of years ago, right? So, in a
yeah,
way, like it's kind of working.
yeah. That's an interesting take. So are we just some messengers? Are we the are we just a shell of something that is like is sperm using us? Are genes using us just to replicate
Or
and make
just
them better?
Yeah, who knows? I mean,
Who knows? Yeah.
no, but I think it's important to recognize that, like, I mean, this is more of kind of a, I don't know what to call it, like not really talking like evolutionary biologically, just like that, on a personal level, like death is what gives life meaning, right? Like if you
Absolutely.
if you lived forever, it would just become, at least through the way that we understand our own existence. I mean, this could be negated if you had a different perspective, but just through like the way we understand it, yeah. With that idea of living forever would kind of become mundane, and it would be um, useless in a way. So that's interesting. I
Yeah.
think. What do you think about that?
I agree with you. I mean, admittedly, I don't want to die. I'm sure you don't want to really die either, right? A lot of people don't want to die. I mean, that's just it's not you don't want because people fear the unknown, and death,
Right.
as far as we know, is pretty unknown.
It's like the most unknown thing.
The most unknown thing.
Yeah.
And so yeah, so the cessation of life is what gives life its meaning, because everything you do in the time that you are allowed is meaningful. So you have to do you have to commit and leave a positive mark. Hopefully it's positive.
Right.
Leave a positive mark in the existence that you are in before you are no longer within this existence. And I think that's something that's very important. I mean, you and I will die, but what we do won't.
Right.
Our actions, we physically won't be here, but our intangible actions will always, they'll permeate throughout time.
Yeah.
Hopefully,
No. I mean, I think.
I hope we do something impactful, right? But
I mean
like,
that. I think that's even subjective. Like that term, impactful, right? Like just
right, it is. It totally is.
that like that's what's insane, right? Like just the most minute action in your day or in your life is like could permeate in, like, I mean, I think you even were the one that introduced me to the like butterfly effect. Like the flap of a butterfly's wings will cause a hurricane sometime
Right.
someday,
Yeah.
right? So like
Yeah.
I think that's what's interesting is like if you just live your life like to what you deem the fullest, I mean, you're inevitably going to be making an effect on the world or the universe or whatever boundary you want to set, right? You're going to be making an effect in that way, which I think is very reassuring in terms of the idea of life and subsequently death.
Yeah, I agree with you. I do. So I wanted to actually talk about a few more things. The next thing is there's actually, I know we discussed the DMT theory,
Mm,
but we kind of got not off track, but we had an open dialogue about that, and I think that was really important because it definitely opened up avenues of conversation that people can consider, that are, our audience or whoever is listening. These are things to consider about death and like the about life. And I don't know, we talked about a lot. We talked about biology, we talked about, I don't know,
yeah.
it was good.
I
And
mean,
hopefully,
yeah. No, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, no, so I was just saying hopefully it opened up a dialogue about that. But I actually wanted to touch on another theory, one more theory. It's a consciousness theory.
Oh,
Oh, consciousness, it's buzzword.
yeah.
Every Yeah. So there were some scientists from Southampton University. They actually found that awareness remains several minutes after death.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yeah. So this study was called Awareness During Resuscitation, a Prospective Study.
Yeah.
So they took 2,060 cardiac arrest survivors,
Mm-hmm.
and they interviewed them. And 46% of those 2,060 survivors, there was some common themes that they experienced during cardiac arrest. Some of them were fear. Some of them were of animals and plants. Some
Whoa.
of them were of bright lights. Some of them of violence. And then some of families. And some of them even recalled events during resuscitation. So the whole thing of resuscitation is you're clinically dead, right?
Right.
So you have to be resuscitated. You have to be brought back to life.
Yeah. So how?
So
Right there.
how is it
Yeah.
exactly? So how is it that some of them are able to recall events during resuscitation if they are considered clinically dead? So that means awareness or consciousness still presides within whatever domain you want to consider, whether it's within the domain of your soul, whether it's the domain within the domain of your mind, of your brain. It
Mm-hmm.
still exists several minutes after you are considered dead.
Interesting.
So does that prove that awareness or consciousness exists separately from the body? You know what I mean? So what I'm trying to say is consciousness and is the body, are they mutually exclusive from one another?
I mean, yeah, I think the crazy thing is, I think if we like answered that question, death would become like not even that big of a deal. We'd be like we're just shedding this body. Like that's all it would be, right? Like it would be.
Right. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that's what's so like just amazing about this whole discussion is that when you really look at the root of it, it is like the idea of consciousness. Like it seems like it always goes back to that. And like even here, we're talking about death. Like that's where it, like death is really like what is the effect on consciousness, and it's unknown. And that's why it's like so taboo, scary, and fascinating. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Some people even say that death is just the next chapter of existence.
Right.
Life is just 50% of it, or maybe even a smaller percentage of what existence really is. I mean, this kind of goes back to our previous episode, the egg, right? Like where his consciousness or his being and the things that he has experienced carry on with him into a different realm
Mm-hmm.
of gods or whatever it is, and then he comes back into the physical world.
Right.
So that's death could literally be just another version of life,
Mm-hmm.
an altered version of life, because life ultimately is existence, right?
Right.
And so if consciousness still exists after this part of existence, then that must mean it exists in the next part of existence, which is death.
Yeah.
So,
Or whatever it actually is. That's just a
or whatever it actually
label
is. Yeah.
given it. But yeah, no, it's
Yeah. I mean, we don't, I mean, at the end of the day, we don't know what death really is, right? But because of these experiences, because of, near death experiences, people have actually obsessed with the idea of death,
yeah.
because they say they feel so at peace, like there's nothing you have to worry about anymore, right?
Right.
And they chase that feeling, they chase it. And there are some reports that people, they feel euphoria, they yearn to go back to the feeling of death.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really interesting to me, which it kind of opens up to, I'm sure you've heard about, like, religions that worship death. Have you heard of any specifically
No.
that come to mind? No.
No.
So there's actually a religion. I think it's like Colombian Mexican area.
Mm-hmm.
It's called I think it's Mexican. It's called Santa Muerta, which
Mm-hmm.
is Saint's Death, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a religion which fuses Catholicism
Mm-hmm.
with ancient Aztec religions and religious ideas and things like that, and they
Yeah.
literally worship the saint of death.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they're beyond that. There are various gods of death, like throughout time. There's an Assyrian one. The Assyrian one is called Ninsusinak.
Wow.
Ninsusinak,
That's a mouthful.
which is, yeah, it is a mouthful. Ninsusinak, which is an Assyrian god of death, or a guardian of death. And then there's a Babylonian one called Nergal.
And there's
There,
Hades.
and then there's Hades, exactly. And then there's the famous, Egyptian one, Anubis,
Mm.
where he's the guardian of the dead, or the gatekeeper of the underworld, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that? I mean, like, what do you think about this, like, concept that, like, people yearn for death, which is they yearn for the taking away of what they are experiencing,
I mean,
which is life.
right. I think, well, yeah. So I could see where having experienced it and associating it with some euphoria, that it would be, I mean, constantly sought after, right? Like that's kind of, I mean, you could talk about like addiction in that way, that people that are experience euphoria, whether it be from drugs or alcohol, get addicted to that, or they chase that euphoria, and oftentimes never find it. I mean, I don't want to like bring the S word into this, but I mean, I think suicide is acting on that yearning for that feeling of release, which I don't know. At the end of the day, I guess that's that individual's choice.
Yeah, I agree. And
I think that as a society, though, we can work towards making this part of existence, so that that is not kind of sought after, you know.
I agree. Um, I kind of want to ask you a philosophical question, because we've kind of talked about, the scientific things that we think about death, and like the biology and things like that. You could view this as a religious question too. What do you think is after death, or afterlife? Sorry, what do you think is afterlife? There we go.
I that's like, I don't know. There's like that's I mean I've pondered that for as long as I can remember, and I have yet to kind of define that for myself. I like to think that every one individual has the absolute right to believe whatever they think is afterlife, and that like no one should be telling them what to think on that matter, because I think that just the idea of death is something that you can only experience. You can't experience death for someone else. You know what I mean? So
Yeah, isn't that crazy? You can never fully experience this is actually something in cognitive science. You can never fully experience what somebody else is experiencing.
Yeah. No, that
Isn't that like an interesting? Anyways, that was sorry, I went on a tangent there. Go ahead.
no, I mean that's totally true. I mean, everyone is different, so everyone experiences things in a different way. No, but so I that's really all I can really say that I've come to a decision on is that whatever like comforts you or you believe in, I think that's right? Because I mean, even what you just said, right? You can't truly experience whatever someone else is experiencing. So in that way, you should not infringe upon that person's belief of what happens after, because that's what comforts them. That's what they believe in. And so I think that's kind of what I've come to. And personally, yet I have to understand or figure out for myself, not for everybody, but for myself, what lies after death. But hey, I think hopefully one day I'll get that figured out.
Yeah, and to kind of quote a British writer, Alan Watts. He was asked about life and death, and he says, "How would you know you were alive unless you had once been dead?" And I think that's a very
Whoa.
important, and yeah, it's philosophical
Mm-hmm.
to because how do we know what being alive is,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Because to know something, you have to be able to compare it to something
Mm-hmm.
else, right? To know you're breathing, you have to know what it's like to not be breathing,
Yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do we know that we are alive unless we can compare it to what it was like when we were dead? But when we are dead, that means we don't exist. Remember, it's this permanent cessation of all things that keep a biological organism living,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So, and when we, so how do we know this is life? How do we, this kind of opens up a whole nother door for a whole nother topic, but how do we know that what we are experiencing is actually life, or it means to be alive?
Mm-hmm. No, I mean we
So,
don't.
yeah, we don't.
I
Yeah.
mean, for all we know, we could enter what we've defined as death and be like, huh, look what we were experiencing before. Look how much better this is, or worse. We don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess a biologist could argue, well, we know that we are alive because a dead person right here is no longer breathing.
Mm,
Their heart is no longer beating. There is no brain activity occurring.
mm-hmm.
Whereas if you put in a living person, their heart is breathing. Their heart is beating. They are beating. Their heart is beating, they are breathing, and that's a tongue twister.
Yeah, it is.
And their brain has activity.
Yeah.
So there is a comparative analysis right there. So this is life and this is death. Well, sure, biologically,
Yeah.
but well, what about beyond that?
Mm-hmm.
How do we know? Because I mean, we just discussed that individuals are still aware, they are still in a sense conscious even after they are clinically dead.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we know that breathing and a heart beating and brain activity and perception or whatever is the only thing that kind of defines what being alive is or living is?
Yeah.
I don't know. You tell me.
I don't think anybody truly knows.
Yeah. So, I mean, anything else you wanted to? I think we covered some interesting areas
Oh
this
yeah,
episode.
definitely. No, I was I had fun with this one for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So, is there anything you wanted to add before we close this off?
No, I mean, like I said, it was an interesting discussion for sure. I liked the different tangents we took. I think it was, um, I mean, like I was just saying, all I would say, like I said before, is uh, it's a very, I think death is a very individual experience. And with that being said, it is something that you can kind of, you know, figure out how you want to relate to it in your own mind. But also on the flip side of that, it is a very social experience, and that when it does happen, it affects a lot of the individuals around that person. So it's interesting, but yeah, definitely open for discussion for sure.
Yeah. And I completely agree with you. Those are actually really, really good points that you made. And with that said, we kind of, yeah, we kind of did give a bit of an Easter egg of episodes to come.
Definitely.
And yeah, so death. This is our definition of death. This was our experiment of death. So again, remember, this is an experiment. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.